Imagine hearing that. For a brief moment, one of the highest rated video game adaptations ever made wasn't inspired by an epic fantasy, a legendary role playing franchise, or decades of gaming history. It was the sequel to a movie based on a mobile game where colorful birds were launched from a slingshot. That sounds less like a Hollywood success story and more like the setup for a joke. Yet, for a surprising stretch of time, the Angry Birds movie 2 achieved exactly that, earning critical praise that many blockbuster adaptations with vastly larger ambitions never managed to reach. The statistic itself feels almost unbelievable, forcing an uncomfortable question. How did one of modern entertainment's most ridiculed concepts quietly become one of its most celebrated surprises? The disbelief was understandable. By the time the sequel arrived, the cultural explosion surrounding the original game had already faded. Angry Birds no longer dominated phone screens, playground conversations, or merchandise aisles the way it once had. To many audiences, the franchise belonged to another era of smartphone history, remembered more as a passing trend than a timeless phenomenon. A sequel felt unnecessary, even hopelessly late. Expectations settled somewhere between polite indifference and outright dismissal long before anyone bought a ticket. Ironically, that assumption mirrors the emotional state of its unlikely hero. Red, once celebrated as the defender of Bird Island, finds himself haunted by a fear that every public figure eventually faces. What happens after the applause fades? His greatest victory has already happened, and obscurity feels far more terrifying than any slingshot ever did. Yet, while Red worries about losing relevance, an entirely different danger is quietly gathering beyond the horizon. Eagle Island introduces a threat so unexpected that personal insecurity suddenly becomes the least important problem in the room. The film cleverly balances these two anxieties, transforming one into comedy and the other into genuine narrative momentum. That contrast is the first sign that something unusual is happening beneath the colorful surface. Instead of treating its outrageous premise as a limitation, the sequel embraces it with remarkable confidence. Every joke lands with sharper timing than expected, every character flaw feeds naturally into the comedy, and every ridiculous situation reveals an understanding of storytelling far more sophisticated than critics anticipated. The film never asks audiences to forget how absurd its origins are. Instead, it weaponizes that absurdity, inviting viewers to laugh with it rather than at it. Perhaps that is why so many people underestimated the experience waiting for them. Expectations were built around a fading mobile app, while the filmmakers were quietly constructing a fast paced ensemble comedy driven by clever character dynamics, surprisingly disciplined structure, and an infectious sense of fun. The greatest surprise was never that Angry Birds received another movie. It was that, against every expectation, this sequel discovered something many prestigious adaptations still struggle to find, a story confident enough to soar beyond the game that inspired it. That unexpected success wasn't an accident waiting to be discovered. It was the result of dozens of creative decisions that, when viewed individually, seem small, but together transformed a sequel that almost nobody believed in into one of the most surprising animated comedies of its generation. To understand why audiences and critics responded so differently than expected, we have to look far beyond review scores or box office numbers. The real story is hidden inside the film's construction, where every gag, character choice, and visual decision serves a larger comedic philosophy. Our journey begins with the screenplay itself. Rather than treating the source material as a restrictive set of brand guidelines, the writers reshape its simple premise into a surprisingly disciplined comedy built on escalating misunderstandings, constantly shifting character dynamics, and carefully timed reversals. We'll explore how the narrative maintains momentum without sacrificing emotional clarity, allowing even the most absurd situations to feel internally consistent. From there, the focus shifts to the machinery of laughter. Great comedy rarely depends on randomness, and the Angry Birds movie 2 proves exactly that. Its humor operates with remarkable precision, drawing from traditions that existed long before smartphones. The exaggerated physical reactions, relentless visual escalation, and expressive character animation echo the spirit of classic Looney Tunes cartoons, where every impact becomes a punchline. At the same time, its action sequences often resemble the rhythm of Jackie Chan's greatest action comedies, transforming movement itself into comedy through timing, creativity, and constant cause and effect. Underneath both influences lies an even older foundation rooted in the fearless slapstick traditions of cinema's golden age, where physical storytelling could communicate everything without relying on dialogue. We'll also examine how Sony Pictures Animation embraced those influences through its evolving visual language. The exaggerated facial expressions, elastic posing, rapid fire editing, and confident staging aren't simply stylistic flourishes. They become essential storytelling tools, allowing emotion and comedy to exist within the same frame instead of competing for attention. Every visual exaggeration reinforces character, proving that animation is often at its strongest when it refuses to imitate live action. Perhaps most importantly, this film offers a fascinating case study for an industry still struggling to adapt video games into memorable cinema. While many adaptations become trapped beneath expectations of franchise building, lore expansion, or cinematic universes, this sequel takes a remarkably different approach. It strips away the burden of proving its legitimacy and focuses instead on becoming unapologetically funny. That creative freedom may be the very reason it succeeded where so many larger productions stumbled. By the time we reach the final frame, the question will no longer be how a movie about Angry Birds exceeded expectations. The more revealing question is why Hollywood so often forgets that audiences rarely fall in love with brands alone. They remember stories that embrace imagination, trust comedy, and understand that genuine entertainment can sometimes emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. There was a time when it felt impossible to pick up a smartphone without seeing those unmistakable birds staring back from the screen. Between 2009 and 2012, Angry Birds wasn't simply another successful mobile game, it became a cultural ritual. People who had never considered themselves gamers suddenly found themselves calculating angles on lunch breaks, passing levels during bus rides, or competing with friends over impossible high scores. Its cheerful soundtrack, exaggerated physics, and deceptively simple gameplay turned a handful of cartoon birds into global celebrities almost overnight. Plush toys filled store shelves, television commercials referenced it, and the franchise became one of the defining symbols of the early smartphone era. But internet culture moves with astonishing speed. The same audience that once embraced the game with endless enthusiasm gradually shifted toward new trends, new apps, and new distractions. What had once represented the cutting edge of mobile entertainment slowly became a nostalgic reminder of a different digital age. By the time a second animated film arrived, many viewers assumed the conversation had already ended. In their minds, Angry Birds belonged to yesterday's headlines, making the sequel feel less like a major event and more like an unexpected echo from the past. That perception shaped expectations long before anyone pressed play. A movie based on a phenomenon that had already peaked sounded like the definition of outdated corporate thinking. Skepticism wasn't merely understandable, it felt almost inevitable. Audiences had seen plenty of franchises chase relevance long after cultural momentum disappeared, and few expected this one to rewrite that familiar story. For many animation fans, skipping the theatrical release didn't feel like missing an opportunity. It felt like making the obvious choice. Then something unusual happened. Instead of dominating headlines through massive marketing campaigns or record breaking box office numbers, the sequel found its audience the old fashioned way. Conversations began appearing online from viewers who admitted they had expected very little before being unexpectedly delighted. Recommendations spread quietly through animation communities, comedy enthusiasts, and families looking for an overlooked film to watch together. The message remained surprisingly consistent. This wasn't merely better than expected, it was genuinely funny. That slow wave of appreciation created an unexpected sense of discovery. As more people stumbled across the film through streaming and home viewing, a different kind of excitement emerged. It became one of those rare movies that audiences enjoyed introducing to friends with the simple promise, "Trust me, it's much better than you think." Missing it in theaters suddenly felt like overlooking one of animation's most entertaining surprises. Perhaps that's the strangest part of the Angry Birds story. The franchise that once defined an era of instant downloads eventually earned a second life through patience, recommendation, and rediscovery. Its greatest achievement wasn't recreating the explosive popularity of the original game. It was proving that even after a cultural phenomenon fades, exceptional comedy can still find its audience, sometimes years later, and sometimes exactly when that audience is finally ready to appreciate it. The first film proved that Angry Birds could attract audiences, but it also revealed an important creative crossroads. Translating a mobile game into a feature length story had always been an unusual challenge. The original movie established recognizable personalities and a functioning world, yet it remained closely tied to the expectations surrounding an enormously popular brand. Once that foundation existed, however, the sequel inherited something surprisingly valuable. It no longer had to spend most of its running time explaining who these characters were or why audiences should care about them. Instead, the creative team could ask a much more interesting question. If the introductions were finished, what kind of comedy could this universe actually support? That question became even more significant as leadership behind the project evolved. Rather than simply repeating the formula of the first installment, Sony Pictures Animation entrusted the sequel to director Thorup Van Orman alongside co-director John Rice, a combination that immediately hinted at a different creative philosophy. Rice brought extensive experience in animation direction and comedy staging, while Van Orman arrived with a reputation built on energetic television storytelling that rarely followed conventional rules. Together, they represented less of a continuation than a reinvention. Van Orman's background helps explain why the sequel feels so different from many studio franchise films. Before stepping into feature animation, he had earned admiration through television work that celebrated unpredictability instead of restraint. His stories often embraced exaggerated emotions, surreal visual ideas, and characters who behaved according to comedic logic rather than strict realism. Instead of smoothing every strange edge into something conventionally marketable, his creative instincts leaned toward embracing eccentricity. That sensibility became one of the sequel's defining strengths.
Anyone familiar with the marvelous misadventures of Flapjack can immediately recognize traces of that philosophy. The series delighted in bizarre worlds, expressive character acting, abrupt tonal shifts, and humor that constantly surprised viewers by refusing to settle into predictable rhythms. Even its emotional moments often emerged from absurd situations rather than traditional dramatic setups. Those instincts quietly carried over into the Angry Birds movie too. The jokes arrive with greater confidence, visual exaggeration becomes part of the storytelling itself, and even supporting characters are allowed moments of wonderfully chaotic individuality. the influence extends beyond a single television series. Van Orman belonged to a generation of animation creators who helped shape an era when cartoons became increasingly fearless about experimentation. Productions associated with artists from shows such as Adventure Time demonstrated that audiences could embrace stories balancing emotional sincerity with surreal comedy, rapid-fire visual invention, and seemingly impossible worlds governed by their own internal logic. Rather than treating children as viewers who needed everything simplified, these creators trusted audiences to enjoy unpredictability. That trust echoes throughout nearly every sequence of the sequel. John Rice complemented that creative energy by helping maintain clarity amid the controlled chaos. Comedy thrives on timing, but timing depends upon precision. However outrageous a scene becomes, viewers must always understand where everyone is, what each character wants, and why every escalating disaster remains funny instead of confusing. The partnership between the directors creates an interesting balance. One encourages boundless imagination, while the other ensures the momentum never collapses beneath its own ambition. Just as important was the environment in which those ideas developed. During this period, Sony Pictures Animation was undergoing a broader creative transformation. Rather than relying exclusively on familiar formulas, the studio increasingly demonstrated a willingness to let filmmakers experiment with visual identity, storytelling structure, and comedic voice. That atmosphere encouraged projects to feel distinct instead of interchangeable. It reflected growing confidence that animation could succeed by embracing stronger artistic personalities rather than minimizing them. This shift became especially meaningful because audiences were beginning to notice that Sony's animated features no longer looked or behaved exactly like everyone else's. The studio was cultivating a reputation for taking creative risks, exploring stylized visual techniques, and allowing directors greater influence over the final tone of their films. While every production pursued its own identity, the larger message remained remarkably consistent. Originality was becoming an asset rather than a liability. Within that changing creative culture, The Angry Birds Movie 2 found an unexpected opportunity. Freed from the pressure of proving that the franchise could exist on the big screen, the filmmakers focused on discovering what it could become instead. They stopped treating the source material as a corporate obligation demanding careful preservation and began treating it as a playground for inventive comedy. The result wasn't merely a sequel with sharper jokes. It was a film that understood the greatest advantage of adapting such a simple game. Almost nothing about it imposed creative limitations. Looking back, the production's most significant decision may not have been adding new characters or expanding the fictional world. It was choosing leadership willing to question every assumption about what an Angry Birds movie should feel like. By inviting creators whose instincts were shaped by fearless television animation into a studio increasingly comfortable with experimentation, Sony Pictures Animation created conditions where surprise became possible. The sequel's greatest achievement began long before audiences laughed at a single joke. It started the moment its filmmakers were given permission to stop protecting the franchise and start playing with it instead. Even with a fresh creative direction behind the scenes, one obstacle remained impossible to rewrite. A great film still has to find an audience, and in 2019 that task was especially daunting. The animation landscape had become fiercely competitive, with major studios releasing established franchises backed by enormous marketing campaigns and years of audience goodwill. Family moviegoers had more choices than ever, meaning every new release faced an unforgiving battle for attention. In that environment, a sequel to a film based on a mobile game entered theaters carrying more skepticism than excitement. Timing amplified the challenge. Animated features were no longer viewed as occasional family events but as major cinematic spectacles capable of dominating the global box office. Established brands commanded headlines months before release, creating anticipation that smaller or less fashionable franchises struggled to match. Conversations naturally gravitated toward beloved legacy characters, celebrated studios, and long-awaited continuations. Against that backdrop, Angry Birds seemed like an unlikely contender, not because animation fans disliked it, but because many had quietly stopped thinking about it altogether. That distinction mattered. Indifference is often a greater obstacle than criticism. Negative reactions at least acknowledge a film's existence, while indifference leaves it fighting for recognition before audiences even evaluate its quality. By 2019, the explosive popularity that had once made Angry Birds unavoidable had faded into nostalgia. The mobile gaming landscape had transformed dramatically, introducing countless new titles and changing player habits. The franchise still possessed recognizable characters, but recognition alone could not guarantee excitement. Marketing therefore faced an unusual dilemma. Selling the sequel primarily as another video game adaptation risked reinforcing every assumption audiences already carried into the theater. The promotional campaign instead leaned towards something much broader and considerably smarter. Rather than asking viewers to celebrate the return of a familiar app, it emphasized speed, chaos, personality, and non-stop visual comedy. Trailers highlighted elaborate action sequences, unexpected team-ups, exaggerated reactions, and escalating disasters, presenting the film less as an extension of mobile gaming culture and more as an energetic ensemble comedy. That subtle shift reframed expectations. The central conflict resembled an increasingly ridiculous mission filled with unlikely alliances, improvised plans, and comic misunderstandings. Instead of inviting audiences to admire references to the original game, the marketing showcased momentum. Characters crashed through environments, plans unraveled spectacularly, and every carefully constructed strategy threatened to collapse into hilarious catastrophe. The tone suggested a playful heist adventure driven by comic timing rather than franchise mythology. Equally significant was the decision to broaden the emotional and comedic appeal beyond the core cast. Promotional material introduced the hatchlings as an important secondary storyline, and they immediately served a practical purpose. Their adventures operated almost like miniature silent comedies, relying on expressive animation, escalating physical gags, and universally understandable situations. Younger viewers could enjoy them without following every detail of the larger narrative, while older audiences recognized the craftsmanship behind jokes built almost entirely through visual storytelling. This approach reflected an understanding that family animation succeeds best when multiple generations laugh for different reasons at the same moment. Adults might appreciate the screenplay's clever dialogue or character insecurity, while children respond instinctively to exaggerated movement and escalating physical humor. The hatchlings bridged those experiences, creating sequences that required little explanation because the comedy emerged directly from action, rhythm, and visual clarity. They also became memorable elements in trailers, giving the campaign instantly recognizable moments that communicated the film's playful personality in only a few seconds. The marketing's strongest decision, however, may have been what it chose not to emphasize. Rather than constantly reminding audiences that Angry Birds originated as one of history's biggest mobile games, the campaign gradually treated that fact as secondary. The birds themselves became the attraction. Their relationships, rivalries, insecurities, and comic chemistry occupied center stage, allowing the franchise to stand on its own as animated entertainment instead of remaining permanently attached to its technological origins. Yet overcoming years of declining cultural momentum remained extraordinarily difficult. Many potential viewers had already written the sequel off without watching a single scene. For them, the title alone triggered assumptions formed long before the first trailer appeared. A surprising number of people believed they already knew exactly what kind of movie this would be, even though the filmmakers had fundamentally reimagined its comedic identity. This disconnect created one of the most fascinating gaps between perception and reality in recent animated cinema. While the creative team quietly built a fast-paced slapstick adventure with confident comic instincts, public conversation often remained trapped in memories of an aging smartphone phenomenon. Marketing could hint at the transformation, but only the finished film could fully reveal it. Looking back, the promotional strategy almost feels like an exercise in carefully changing the subject. Instead of arguing that audiences should care because Angry Birds was once a global sensation, it invited them to enjoy something much simpler, a relentlessly entertaining comedy filled with inventive action, expressive animation, and characters whose failures were every bit as enjoyable as their victories. That invitation proved easier to appreciate after people finally experienced the film, explaining why enthusiastic recommendations gradually became more persuasive than advertisements. The crowded marketplace undoubtedly limited the sequel's immediate visibility, but it also highlighted an important truth. Surrounded by celebrated franchises competing for attention, the Angry Birds movie 2 could never rely on brand power alone. Its only realistic path forward was to surprise people. Ironically, that very necessity became one of its greatest creative advantages, forcing the film to earn affection through laughter rather than reputation. The sequel wastes remarkably little time reminding us that peace is not always the same as harmony. Bird Island and Pig Island may no longer be locked in outright war, but they certainly haven't embraced lasting friendship. Instead, their rivalry has evolved into something far more ridiculous, an endless cycle of elaborate pranks. Birds launch harmless tricks at pigs, pigs answer with even bigger practical jokes, and both sides treat the entire exchange as if it were an unspoken tradition. It is conflict stripped of genuine malice, preserved almost entirely because neither community knows what else to do with its shared history. From a storytelling perspective, this opening accomplishes something quietly clever. Rather than resetting the world to another invasion, the film establishes a new equilibrium built on routine. The characters have moved beyond their original battle, yet they remain emotionally attached to the identities that battle created. Everyone continues playing familiar roles because abandoning them would require redefining who they are. Comedy emerges naturally from that repetition, as increasingly absurd pranks replace genuine warfare without changing the competitive spirit underneath. The rhythm of these exchanges also immediately establishes the film's comic personality. Every prank escalates through exaggerated reactions, carefully timed reversals, and visual cause and effect. Instead of relying primarily on dialogue, many jokes unfold through movement itself. A simple setup transforms into escalating chaos, every action triggering another unforeseen consequence. The audience begins laughing not because events are realistic, but because the internal comic logic remains perfectly consistent. Every ridiculous outcome feels inevitable once the first domino falls. Standing at the center of this carefully maintained balance is Red, whose public image has changed dramatically since the previous adventure. Once viewed as an outsider whose anger isolated him from everyone around him, he has become Bird Island's celebrated protector. Citizens admire him. They cheer for him. His face has become synonymous with security and courage. On the surface, Red appears to have achieved everything he ever wanted. He finally belongs. Yet the opening quietly reveals that belonging and emotional security are not the same thing. Every compliment Red receives seems to satisfy him for only a brief moment before another is needed. Every successful rescue reinforces his reputation, but never permanently eases the anxiety beneath it. His confidence depends upon remaining indispensable. The applause matters because it reassures him that people still value his presence. Remove the constant validation, and an uncomfortable possibility immediately returns. What if they stop needing him? That fear transforms heroism into something unexpectedly fragile. Red is not addicted to danger itself. He is addicted to the purpose danger provides. As long as Bird Island requires saving, his identity feels secure. The moment life becomes peaceful, his greatest achievement threatens to become yesterday's news. The film presents this insecurity with surprising honesty beneath layers of comedy, suggesting that public admiration can become its own emotional trap. When someone builds their entire sense of worth around being the hero, ordinary happiness begins to feel strangely threatening. The screenplay wisely avoids turning this psychological conflict into melodrama. Instead, it expresses Red's insecurity through behavior. He eagerly inserts himself into situations where his help may not actually be necessary. He instinctively positions himself at the center of every crisis. Even his interactions with others reveal someone constantly searching for confirmation that his reputation remains intact. The comedy works because the audience recognizes an exaggeration of a very human fear. Most people have wondered, at some point, whether their importance depends entirely upon what they can do for others. This emotional foundation gives the opening greater depth than its playful tone initially suggests. The prank war isn't merely entertaining spectacle. It provides Red with a continuous opportunity to perform the role he has come to depend upon. Every harmless conflict allows him to reaffirm his place within the community, reinforcing a cycle that feels comforting even if it prevents genuine growth. Then, almost without warning, the story introduces an entirely different scale of conflict. Far beyond the familiar rivalry between birds and pigs lies Eagle Island, a frozen landscape unlike anything the audience has previously encountered. Its introduction immediately changes the film's emotional geography. Until this point, the world has operated according to playful competition and harmless retaliation. Eagle Island interrupts that rhythm with an unsettling reminder that the familiar game between the two islands means very little when confronted by a genuine external threat. Zeta's arrival accomplishes far more than introducing the film's antagonist. Her massive ice projectiles instantly redefine the stakes. Unlike the carefully orchestrated pranks exchanged between birds and pigs, these attacks carry unmistakable destructive intent. The contrast is essential. What once seemed like significant conflict is suddenly exposed as childish posturing compared with the danger now approaching from beyond their shared horizon. Visually, the transition reinforces this shift in tone. Warm, energetic environments give way to icy landscapes and enormous frozen weapons capable of devastating entire communities. The comedy never disappears, but it gains urgency because the characters are no longer reacting to familiar rivals whose behavior they understand. They face an unpredictable force with motivations still hidden from both them and the audience. Perhaps the opening's smartest structural decision is how naturally this external danger intersects with Red's internal struggle. A hero who fears becoming irrelevant suddenly encounters the largest crisis imaginable. On paper, this appears to be exactly what he wants, an opportunity to prove his value once again. Yet that coincidence carries an uncomfortable implication. If Red unconsciously needs disasters to validate his identity, then genuine peace becomes emotionally threatening in ways he has barely begun to understand. By the end of the first act's setup, the film has quietly assembled all the essential ingredients for its larger journey. The birds and pigs remain trapped inside familiar patterns. Red continues chasing reassurance disguised as heroism, and a mysterious enemy has arrived with enough power to force old rivals toward an impossible alliance. The stage is set not merely for another adventure, but for a comedy that uses escalating chaos to expose the insecurities its characters have spent so long hiding behind laughter. The arrival of Zeta's frozen assault does more than threaten two neighboring islands. It dismantles the foundation of a rivalry that once seemed permanent. For years, birds and pigs defined themselves through opposition. Every prank, every argument, and every exaggerated act of retaliation reinforced a simple belief that each side knew exactly who the enemy was. The ice bombs exposed the flaw in that certainty almost instantly. When a danger powerful enough to destroy both islands appears, old conflicts begin to look remarkably small. That realization leads to one of the sequel's smartest narrative reversals. Instead of escalating the familiar feud, the story asks whether the feud has any value left at all. The answer arrives in the unlikely form of Leonard, King of Pig Island. In the first film, Leonard embodied deception and selfish ambition, manipulating others to satisfy his own desires. Audiences naturally expect another scheme whenever he appears. The screenplay understands that expectation and uses it to create immediate comedy. Watching Leonard approach Red with the language of cooperation feels inherently suspicious because both the audience and Red have every reason to believe betrayal is inevitable. Their meeting becomes a negotiation built almost entirely on distrust. Every conversation carries years of accumulated resentment beneath its surface. Neither leader is comfortable admitting that the other might be right. Every agreement feels temporary. Every gesture of goodwill is met with cautious skepticism. The dialogue succeeds because it acknowledges that genuine reconciliation cannot erase history overnight. These characters remember every previous conflict, making cooperation feel awkward rather than magically effortless. Humor naturally emerges from that discomfort. Instead of pretending centuries of rivalry disappear after a single conversation, the film allows both leaders to remain defensive, sarcastic, and occasionally childish. Their personalities clash constantly, yet the audience also recognizes an unavoidable truth neither character wants to admit. Survival now depends upon collaboration. Pride has become a luxury they can no longer afford. This moment quietly subverts the very premise that made Angry Birds famous. The original mobile game thrived on an endless cycle of birds attacking pigs. Conflict wasn't simply part of the franchise, it was the franchise. By proposing a truce, the sequel deliberately abandons the simplest version of its own identity. That decision could have felt like a betrayal of the source material, yet it ultimately expands the possibilities of the story. Once birds and pigs stop functioning exclusively as enemies, their contrasting personalities become sources of comedy instead of repetitive conflict. The alliance also reveals something important about Red's psychology. Agreeing to work beside Leonard requires more than strategic thinking. It demands emotional flexibility, a quality Red still struggles to develop. His instinct is to remain suspicious because certainty feels safer than trust. Throughout the opening act, he has measured the world through familiar categories of heroes and villains. This mission immediately complicates those categories, forcing him into situations where emotional intelligence becomes just as valuable as courage. Every meaningful adventure eventually requires crossing an invisible threshold, and this uneasy partnership becomes exactly that moment. The story shifts from defending familiar territory toward entering the unknown. Instead of waiting for attacks to continue, the characters choose action. Their objective extends beyond survival. They must investigate Eagle Island itself, transforming the narrative from reactive comedy into an energetic espionage adventure built around infiltration, improvisation, and teamwork. Assembling that team introduces another fascinating layer to the film's character dynamics. Chuck and Baum return as dependable companions whose personalities immediately re-establish the chemistry audiences expect. Chuck's relentless speed continues generating impulsive energy, while Baum's overwhelming enthusiasm remains balanced by his explosive unpredictability. Their friendship with Red creates comforting continuity, reminding viewers that despite the evolving stakes, the emotional core of the series still rests upon relationships rather than spectacle alone. The most significant addition, however, arrives through Silver. Unlike Red, Silver approaches problems almost entirely through observation, analysis, and engineering logic. She studies systems instead of reacting emotionally to them. Where Red trusts instinct, she trusts evidence. Where he values determination, she values preparation. The screenplay wisely avoids presenting these differences as simple opposites. Instead, they represent competing leadership philosophies, each effective in certain situations and deeply flawed in others. Silver's intelligence immediately disrupts the established group dynamic. She contributes practical solutions that nobody else considers, demonstrating remarkable technical creativity without demanding attention for it. Her confidence comes from competence rather than ego. This distinction matters because it quietly challenges Red's understanding of authority. Until now, leadership has largely meant stepping forward during moments of danger. Silver suggests another possibility. Sometimes leadership begins long before the crisis, through careful planning that prevents disaster from happening in the first place. That contrast generates both comedy and tension. Red often interprets her confidence as criticism because his own insecurities make disagreement feel personal. Silver, meanwhile, remains focused on solving problems rather than protecting anyone's pride. Their interactions expose the emotional blind spots each character carries into the mission, ensuring that future conflicts emerge naturally from personality instead of artificial misunderstanding. The final member of the operation introduces perhaps the greatest mystery. Mighty Eagle has always occupied an unusual place within this universe. He projects effortless confidence, overwhelming strength, and legendary status, appearing almost larger than the world surrounding him. Yet the sequel quietly begins peeling away that myth. When Eagle Island enters the conversation, subtle changes appear beneath his familiar bravado. His reluctance feels disproportionate. His confidence hesitates. For the first time, the supposedly invincible hero seems genuinely uncomfortable. The film resists explaining that reaction immediately, choosing instead to let curiosity grow through behavior rather than exposition. Tiny moments become surprisingly revealing. Avoided conversations. Hesitant expressions. Attempts to redirect attention elsewhere. These details hint that Mighty Eagle's connection to Eagle Island extends far beyond geography. Something from his past remains unresolved, and his reluctance suggests memories far more complicated than simple fear. Structurally, this is an elegant piece of storytelling. While the mission promises external adventure, the screenplay quietly plants seeds for internal conflict across nearly every major character. Red must confront his dependence on validation. Silver challenges established ideas about leadership. Leonard struggles to earn trust despite his history. Mighty Eagle carries secrets capable of reshaping how audiences perceive him entirely. By the time the team finally commits to the mission, the transition feels complete. The familiar rivalry that once defined the franchise has been replaced by an uneasy alliance, a carefully assembled group with conflicting personalities, and a destination filled with unanswered questions. The comedy remains energetic, but beneath every joke lies a growing sense that this journey will test far more than their ability to stop an enemy. It will challenge the identities each of them has spent so long pretending were already complete. Every successful comedy eventually reaches the point where laughter alone is no longer enough. The jokes continue, the pace remains energetic, but the story quietly demands a deeper emotional investment. For the Angry Birds movie too, that turning point arrives the moment the mission stops feeling like an outrageous adventure and begins revealing the personal failures hidden beneath every character's confident exterior. Until now, Eagle Island has functioned primarily as a mysterious destination, its frozen landscape serving as an obstacle filled with elaborate visual gags and increasingly dangerous encounters. But once the team uncovers the true scale of Zeta's operation, the conflict expands dramatically. The enormous ice projectiles raining toward Bird Island and Pig Island are not isolated attacks or random acts of intimidation. They are components of a far more ambitious plan. Zeta intends to eliminate both islands entirely. Her goal is astonishingly simple in concept and terrifying in execution. By freezing and destroying the neighboring homes of birds and pigs alike, she intends to transform them into the tropical paradise she believes she deserves. From her perspective, the frozen wasteland of Eagle Island is not merely inconvenient. It is a prison she has endured for far too long. The warm beaches she envies represent freedom, comfort, and the life she believes was unfairly denied. What makes this motivation surprisingly effective is that it avoids presenting Zeta as evil for its own sake. Her frustration begins somewhere audiences can understand. Endless isolation inside a harsh climate naturally breeds resentment. Living surrounded by snow while watching others enjoy warmth creates a believable emotional foundation. The screenplay then exaggerates that frustration until it becomes absurdly destructive, producing a villain whose emotional logic remains recognizable even as her actions spiral into outrageous extremes. The comedy itself benefits from this approach. Rather than interrupting the film's playful tone with excessive darkness, Zeta's plan feels grand enough to generate spectacle while remaining exaggerated enough to preserve the story's light-hearted identity. She is driven by genuine disappointment, but her solution carries the oversized confidence of someone convinced that every problem can be solved simply by moving everyone else out of the way. Yet the real emotional explosion arrives from somewhere entirely unexpected. For much of the story, Mighty Eagle has maintained the carefully constructed image audiences expect from a legendary hero. He projects wisdom, confidence, and effortless superiority, even when circumstances become chaotic. His reluctance to discuss Eagle Island has lingered quietly in the background, encouraging viewers to suspect unfinished business without fully understanding its nature. Then the truth emerges. Zeta is not simply an enemy from his homeland. She is his former fiancée. The revelation instantly transforms countless earlier moments. His hesitation no longer appears mysterious for its own sake. It becomes painfully human. The supposedly fearless Mighty Eagle did not leave Eagle Island because of destiny or noble sacrifice. He ran away from commitment, abandoning someone who trusted him because confronting difficult emotions proved more frightening than escaping them. That single confession completely reshapes his character. The film refuses to protect his heroic reputation. Instead, it dismantles it with surprising honesty. Mighty Eagle's greatest weakness has never been physical courage. It has always been emotional courage. Facing danger is easy when compared to accepting responsibility for hurting another person. His enormous strength cannot compensate for the fear that led him to abandon a relationship rather than face uncertainty. This admission immediately damages the fragile trust holding the team together. Every member realizes that one of the mission's most important pieces of information has been hidden from them from the very beginning. They have entered enemy territory guided by someone with deeply personal connections to its leader, yet nobody was given the opportunity to prepare for those complications. The frustration extends beyond simple secrecy. If Mighty Eagle concealed something this significant, what else might remain hidden? Confidence begins dissolving into suspicion. Cooperation gives way to hesitation. The emotional fractures that had quietly existed beneath the group's surface suddenly become impossible to ignore. Interestingly, the screenplay doesn't portray this collapse as the fault of one character alone. Instead, it reveals how every member contributes to the growing instability through different flaws. Mighty Eagle's cowardice plants the initial crack, but others unintentionally widen it through their own limitations. Nowhere is that more apparent than in Red's leadership. Throughout the journey, Silver has repeatedly demonstrated remarkable intelligence, careful observation, and practical problem-solving. She notices patterns others overlook and approaches danger with calm analytical thinking rather than instinctive reactions. Time after time, the story quietly proves her value. Yet Red continues treating leadership as something that belongs exclusively to him. His resistance is subtle but persistent. Suggestions become arguments. Collaboration becomes competition. Every time Silver offers an alternative strategy, Red instinctively interprets it as a challenge to his authority rather than an opportunity to strengthen the mission. Psychologically, this behavior perfectly continues the insecurity established during the opening act. Red still equates leadership with personal worth. Sharing responsibility feels dangerously close to surrendering relevance. If someone else proves equally capable, what makes him special? The fear is rarely spoken aloud, but it quietly shapes nearly every decision he makes. That emotional blind spot becomes increasingly costly. Rather than combining Silver's careful planning with his own determination, Red repeatedly insists upon taking control alone. His confidence gradually shifts from admirable persistence into counterproductive stubbornness. The distinction is important because great leadership depends not on always having the right answer, but on recognizing when someone else does. The consequences arrive with ruthless efficiency. As conflicting decisions pile upon one another, the mission unravels. The team loses its momentum. Opportunities disappear. Before anyone can fully recover from the emotional shock surrounding Mighty Eagle's confession, Red's refusal to adapt places everyone in even greater danger. Their capture inside the massive ice superweapon represents far more than a temporary setback. It is the physical manifestation of every unresolved flaw driving the story forward. A team divided by hidden truths, wounded pride, and competing definitions of leadership inevitably becomes vulnerable. The trap succeeds because the characters have already trapped themselves inside their own emotional limitations. By the midpoint, the adventure has fundamentally changed. What began as a chaotic mission to stop an eccentric villain has evolved into something considerably more personal. Zeta's bitterness threatens entire civilizations, Mighty Eagle's past has shattered the group's confidence, and Red's inability to trust another leader has turned preventable mistakes into genuine disaster. Escaping the superweapon will require more than courage or clever planning. It will demand the one thing every major character has spent the entire film avoiding, the willingness to confront the truths about themselves that laughter could only hide for so long. Every strong climax answers a question that has been quietly forming since the opening scene. In the Angry Birds movie too, that question has never been whether the heroes possess enough strength to stop the ice cannon. The film has repeatedly demonstrated that courage, speed, intelligence, and raw power already exist within the team. The real uncertainty is whether those qualities can coexist without being undermined by pride, insecurity, or fear. The final act succeeds because the external battle becomes inseparable from the character's internal growth. Faced with disaster, Red finally reaches the emotional crossroads he has spent the entire story avoiding. Until this moment, every crisis reinforced his instinct to take control personally. Leadership, in his mind, meant carrying the burden alone. Yet every setback has exposed the limitations of that philosophy. Determination without collaboration has repeatedly led the team into unnecessary danger, and the enormous ice superweapon now stands as undeniable proof that courage alone cannot solve every problem. The breakthrough arrives not through another heroic speech but through a simple act of trust. Silver presents the solution she has been quietly building toward, an intricate engineering strategy centered on an elaborate system of interconnected cables and precisely coordinated movement. Rather than overpowering the machine, the plan exploits its own structure. Every connection must function at exactly the right moment. Every participant must fulfill a specific role, and every action depends upon complete confidence in everyone else. It is less a display of brute force than an exercise in carefully orchestrated cooperation. The sequence beautifully illustrates one of the film's central ideas. Earlier conflicts relied upon launching objects directly at problems, echoing the mechanics of the original mobile game. Here, however, victory depends upon understanding systems instead of simply attacking them. Silver's engineering mind recognizes relationships where others see isolated pieces. She understands that changing a single point within a complex mechanism can reshape everything connected to it. Visually, the climax embraces controlled chaos with remarkable confidence. Characters race across collapsing structures, cables stretch under impossible tension, machinery spins toward catastrophic failure, and split-second timing transforms every movement into another perfectly staged comic beat. The film never abandons its playful energy, even as the stakes reach their highest point. Instead, slapstick and suspense begin operating together, each making the other more satisfying. What elevates the sequence beyond spectacle is the distribution of responsibility. No single character can complete the plan alone. Chuck's extraordinary speed becomes essential at one critical moment. Bomb's unique abilities contribute where precision requires overwhelming force. Leonard's resourcefulness proves unexpectedly valuable despite his history as an adversary. Even the smallest actions matter because Silver's design depends upon every participant performing exactly when needed. The hatchlings, whose parallel adventure has unfolded almost like a miniature silent comedy throughout the film, become the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. Their innocent determination unexpectedly intersects with the larger conflict at precisely the right moment, proving that meaningful contributions are not measured by size or reputation. Their intervention feels earned because the screenplay has consistently treated them as active participants rather than decorative comic relief. What once appeared to be a charming side story suddenly reveals itself as another carefully placed thread within the larger narrative. Meanwhile, Mighty Eagle confronts a challenge no amount of physical strength can overcome. For the first time, his greatest act of heroism requires vulnerability instead of invincibility. Escaping responsibility has defined the mistake that shaped both his life and Zeta's bitterness. The climax therefore refuses to resolve their conflict through combat alone. Before genuine healing becomes possible, Mighty Eagle must acknowledge the emotional damage created by his own cowardice. The legendary hero who once fled uncomfortable truths finally chooses to face them directly. That decision carries surprising weight because it transforms his arc from parody into redemption. His apology cannot erase the past, nor does the film pretend that it should. Instead, it demonstrates that accepting responsibility is the first necessary step toward rebuilding trust. Emotional courage ultimately becomes more meaningful than any physical feat he performs during the battle, reinforcing the story's belief that genuine strength begins with honesty. At the center of it all stands Red, whose final choice quietly completes the journey established in the opening act. When the crisis ends and the islands are finally safe, Red receives another opportunity to be celebrated as the lone hero. Earlier in the film, he almost certainly would have accepted that role without hesitation. Recognition represented security. Applause reassured him that he still mattered. This time, he chooses differently. Instead of protecting his image, Red publicly acknowledges the truth. Silver's engineering brilliance made victory possible. His friends executed the impossible together. Every member of the mission contributed something irreplaceable. By openly sharing the credit, Red demonstrates growth far greater than defeating any villain. He no longer measures his worth by standing above everyone else. He discovers that real leadership sometimes means stepping aside so others receive the recognition they deserve. It is a deceptively simple moment, yet it completely transforms his character. The bird who once feared becoming irrelevant finally realizes that importance is not diminished by lifting others. If anything, trust creates stronger communities than admiration ever could. The resolution naturally extends this transformation beyond the central cast. Birds, pigs, and eagles no longer exist as isolated societies defined by suspicion and old grievances. Their shared victory creates a new foundation built upon cooperation rather than rivalry. The divisions that once fueled endless conflict gradually give way to coexistence, suggesting that identities rooted entirely in opposition can evolve into something healthier without losing their individuality. The celebratory wedding perfectly captures that new status quo. On the surface, it provides the joyful conclusion expected from a family comedy, filled with colorful animation, playful humor, and a sense of collective relief after overwhelming danger. Beneath that festive atmosphere, however, lies a more meaningful symbol. A ceremony traditionally associated with union becomes the ideal image for a world where former enemies have learned to build a future together instead of endlessly repeating the past. By the closing moments, the film has quietly achieved something surprisingly ambitious. It begins with characters trapped inside familiar identities inherited from a simple mobile game built around perpetual conflict. It ends with those same characters discovering that lasting happiness requires abandoning the roles they believed defined them. The birds are no longer valuable because they fight pigs. The pigs are no longer meaningful because they oppose birds. And Red is no longer a hero because everyone needs saving. He becomes one because he finally understands that the greatest victories are rarely won alone. What makes Red a far more compelling protagonist than his permanently irritated expression initially suggests is that his defining emotion changes dramatically between the two films, while its underlying cause remains almost identical. On the surface, he appears to have undergone a complete transformation. The isolated outsider who once lashed out at everyone around him has become Bird Island's celebrated defender. His life looks better in every measurable way. He has friends, respect, and a meaningful place within his community. Yet beneath those visible changes, the same emotional wound continues shaping his decisions. The first film presents Red's anger as a social defense mechanism. He lives in a world where optimism is the norm, making his frustration appear abnormal before anyone understands its source. Other birds see an irritable troublemaker. What they fail to recognize is someone who has spent years expecting rejection before it happens. Anger becomes a protective shield. If he pushes others away first, they never gain the opportunity to exclude him. It is a painful strategy, but an understandable one. Loneliness often disguises itself as hostility because admitting the desire for connection feels far more vulnerable than pretending not to care. His eventual acceptance into the community seems, at first glance, like the perfect ending to that emotional struggle. The hero finally belongs. The outcast earns admiration. The lonely bird discovers friendship. Traditional storytelling might conclude the character's journey there, suggesting that external success permanently heals internal insecurity. The sequel wisely refuses that simplification. Instead, it asks a question many stories avoid. What happens after someone achieves everything they believed would make them happy? More importantly, what if the fear never truly disappears? Red no longer worries about being ignored because he lacks value. He worries about being forgotten because someone else might become more valuable. The emotion has evolved, but its foundation remains remarkably familiar. His childhood isolation taught him that belonging could disappear without warning. Becoming a hero temporarily solved the problem, yet it also created a new dependency. His identity now relies upon remaining indispensable. This is where Red begins resembling countless real people who experience what psychologists often describe as imposter syndrome. Despite undeniable accomplishments, they quietly fear that recognition is temporary, fragile, or somehow undeserved. Every achievement provides relief, but only briefly. The next challenge immediately becomes another test of whether they truly deserve the praise they receive. The sequel subtly captures this emotional pattern throughout Red's behavior. He constantly searches for opportunities to prove his usefulness. Peace makes him restless because peaceful communities require fewer heroes. Every compliment reassures him for a moment before anxiety quietly returns. Instead of enjoying his accomplishments, he feels pressured to defend them continuously. That insecurity explains why Red reacts so strongly whenever his leadership is questioned. His resistance rarely comes from arrogance alone. More often, it reflects panic disguised as confidence. If someone else demonstrates equal or greater capability, his carefully constructed identity suddenly feels unstable. Losing control of a situation becomes emotionally linked to losing the acceptance he fought so hard to earn. This psychological continuity gives the sequel surprising depth. Rather than inventing an entirely new flaw for dramatic convenience, the screenplay allows Red's original wound to evolve naturally. Childhood loneliness becomes adult performance anxiety. Isolation transforms into the fear of irrelevance. The circumstances change, but the emotional logic remains completely consistent. Perhaps the most significant difference between the two films lies in how Red responds to that fear. During the first story, anger dominates his interactions. Frustration becomes his primary language because vulnerability feels dangerous. Every sarcastic remark and impatient outburst creates another layer of emotional protection between himself and everyone around him. Although that behavior frequently causes conflict, it also reflects someone who genuinely believes openness will only lead to disappointment. By the sequel, however, those emotional walls have begun to crack. Red still struggles with insecurity, but the screenplay increasingly allows audiences to recognize the fear hiding beneath his determination. His mistakes emerge less from hostility than from desperation. He desperately wants to remain important, desperately wants to protect his reputation, and desperately wants reassurance that the community still needs him. These motivations make his flaws easier to empathize with because they expose the vulnerable person hidden beneath the heroic image. That shift from destructive anger toward constructive vulnerability represents one of the character's greatest achievements. Instead of learning to suppress emotion entirely, Red gradually learns to express it more honestly. The goal is not becoming fearless. It is accepting that insecurity does not automatically diminish his worth. No character contributes more to that lesson than Silver. On paper, Silver appears to function primarily as the brilliant engineer whose intelligence helps save the mission. Psychologically, however, her role is considerably more important. She becomes the perfect foil for Red because she challenges the assumptions supporting his entire identity. Red believes leadership is demonstrated through action, instinct, and visible courage. Silver consistently proves that thoughtful observation, preparation, and technical understanding can be equally heroic. She solves problems Red cannot solve, yet she does so without seeking applause or recognition. Her confidence grows from competence rather than external validation. This difference quietly unsettles Red throughout the story. Every successful idea Silver contributes forces him to confront an uncomfortable reality. Being the loudest person in the room does not necessarily make someone the best leader. Heroism is not diminished when another person possesses strengths you do not. Importantly, the screenplay never portrays this dynamic as a competition designed to humiliate Red. Silver does not exist to replace him. She exists to complete him. Their contrasting strengths reveal that effective leadership depends less upon individual perfection than upon recognizing abilities beyond one's own experience. The emotional breakthrough occurs not when Red becomes smarter than Silver, but when he finally trusts her intelligence enough to share responsibility. That decision transforms the meaning of heroism itself. Red stops viewing leadership as a performance requiring constant validation and begins understanding it as a relationship built upon mutual confidence. His willingness to acknowledge Silver's contributions publicly becomes the clearest evidence that he has finally escaped the emotional prison created by his childhood fears. In many ways, Red's journey reflects an experience far more universal than the colorful world surrounding him might suggest. Many people spend years believing that one achievement, one promotion, one victory, or one moment of recognition will permanently silence their insecurities. Life often reveals something more complicated. External success can change circumstances, but genuine healing requires confronting the beliefs formed long before success ever arrived. That is precisely why Red continues to resonate beyond the franchise's playful surface. He is not simply a grumpy bird learning to smile. He is someone discovering that belonging cannot be earned anew every single day. At some point, it must also be believed. Only then can a hero stop proving their worth long enough to simply become part of the community they fought so hard to protect. One of the sequel's most surprising accomplishments is that it refuses to build its central villain around the usual fantasy of unlimited power. Zeta certainly possesses the technology and determination to threaten entire islands, but domination is never presented as her ultimate desire. She does not dream of ruling the world for the sake of control itself. Instead, she wants something almost laughably ordinary. She wants to live somewhere warm. That motivation immediately changes the audience's relationship with her. Most animated villains begin by demanding absolute authority, endless wealth, or personal glory. Zeta's frustration begins with something far more relatable. She wakes up every day surrounded by freezing temperatures, relentless snow, and an environment that seems actively designed to make ordinary life miserable. Even the simplest comforts become impossible when everything instantly freezes. Food loses its appeal, water becomes ice before it can be enjoyed, and relaxation feels like an impossible luxury rather than a basic expectation. The film repeatedly transforms these inconveniences into comedy without undermining their emotional importance. Every exaggerated complaint carries a small kernel of truth. Most viewers have experienced moments when an irritating environment made even minor problems feel dramatically worse. The screenplay simply amplifies that feeling until it becomes spectacularly absurd. Instead of moving to a warmer location like any reasonable person, Zeta decides that destroying two civilizations is the more practical solution. That escalation captures the film's comic philosophy perfectly. The emotional starting point remains believable, while the response grows increasingly ridiculous. Audiences laugh because they recognize the frustration, even though they would never embrace the extreme conclusion. Great comedy often works this way. It begins with recognizable emotion before stretching reality to impossible proportions. Yet reducing Zeta to someone who merely dislikes winter would overlook the deeper emotional current driving her decisions. Beneath every complaint about frozen landscapes lies another wound that never completely healed. Her bitterness is inseparable from abandonment. The revelation surrounding Mighty Eagle transforms Zeta from an entertaining obstacle into a genuinely layered antagonist. Long before the heroes arrived on Eagle Island, she had already experienced profound disappointment. Someone she trusted disappeared rather than facing difficult emotions honestly. That experience reshaped the way she viewed both relationships and the world around her. The frozen landscape became more than an uncomfortable home. It evolved into a constant reminder of promises left unfulfilled. This psychological connection explains why her resentment feels so persistent. Environmental frustration alone might inspire relocation or determination. Emotional betrayal gives that frustration direction. The two experiences reinforce one another until every miserable day on Eagle Island becomes another piece of evidence supporting her increasingly cynical worldview. Eventually, warmth itself transforms into a symbol. It no longer represents pleasant weather. It represents the happier life she believes someone else prevented her from having. Importantly, the screenplay never asks audiences to approve of her methods. Her plan remains catastrophically destructive, and the threat she poses is entirely real. What the film encourages instead is understanding. There is an important difference between explaining a villain and excusing one. Zeta's emotional logic is coherent even when her actions are completely unjustifiable. That distinction gives the story greater maturity than a simple battle between good and evil. Her visual design quietly reinforces these ideas from the moment she appears. Against the endless blues, whites, and pale grays of Eagle Island, Zeta's brilliant magenta feathers create an immediate contradiction. She almost seems too vibrant for the environment surrounding her. Every frame emphasizes the clash between her energetic appearance and the lifeless landscape she inhabits. Animation often communicates personality through color before dialogue begins, and Zeta becomes an excellent example of that principle. The contrast works on multiple levels. Visually, she commands attention whenever she enters the screen because her bold colors naturally separate her from the icy background. Emotionally, those colors hint at someone whose passionate personality has been trapped inside an existence that feels emotionally frozen. Her environment suppresses the warmth she desperately craves, making every visual composition subtly reinforce the central conflict without needing explicit explanation. The animators also give her wonderfully expressive body language that constantly shifts between theatrical confidence and explosive impatience. She rarely appears emotionally neutral. Every gesture feels oversized, every reaction exaggerated, and every outburst charged with restless energy. These choices maintain the film's playful tone while ensuring her anger never feels monotonous. Instead of becoming intimidating through silence, she becomes memorable through personality. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Zeta's characterization, however, is the way she mirrors Mighty Eagle. At first glance, they appear to represent complete opposites. One is celebrated as a legendary hero, while the other threatens innocent communities. One inspires admiration, the other fear. Yet as the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that they are emotionally connected by the same defining moment. Mighty Eagle's greatest flaw has always been avoidance. When confronted with emotional responsibility, he chose escape. Zeta's defining flaw becomes the opposite response. Instead of running away from emotional pain, she refuses to let it go. Both reactions originate from the same event. One character buries guilt beneath arrogance, while the other transforms heartbreak into resentment. Neither finds peace because neither confronts the past honestly. Their lives become parallel examples of how unresolved emotional wounds can shape entirely different personalities. This mirroring adds surprising balance to the narrative. Zeta is not simply the obstacle standing between the heroes and victory. She represents the future awaiting anyone who allows disappointment to define every decision. Mighty Eagle recognizes that possibility because, in many ways, he helped create it. His eventual acceptance of responsibility therefore becomes more than a personal apology. It is an acknowledgement that avoiding painful conversations often allows emotional damage to grow far beyond its original size. Leslie Jones' energetic vocal performance strengthens this dynamic by refusing to portray Zeta as emotionally detached. Her delivery constantly swings between commanding confidence, hilarious irritation, theatrical outrage, and flashes of genuine vulnerability. Even during the character's most outrageous declarations, there remains a sense that real disappointment fuels every exaggerated reaction. That emotional flexibility prevents Zeta from becoming a one-note comic villain despite the intentionally absurd nature of her plan. Ultimately, Zeta succeeds because she embodies the sequel's larger storytelling philosophy. Like nearly every major character, she is not defined by simple labels of hero or villain. She is defined by how she responds to emotional pain. Where Red learns to replace insecurity with trust and Mighty Eagle learns to replace avoidance with accountability, Zeta allows frustration and heartbreak to harden into obsession. Her defeat therefore represents more than the destruction of an ice cannon. It marks the moment when the story rejects bitterness as a foundation for the future, choosing reconciliation over resentment without pretending the past never happened. One of the clearest reasons the Angry Birds Movie 2 feels more confident than many animated ensemble films is that it understands a simple storytelling principle: supporting characters should never exist merely to fill the background. Every member of the cast contributes something unique to both the narrative and the comedy. Remove almost any one of them, and the film immediately loses a specific rhythm, perspective, or function that nobody else can replace. Instead of surrounding Red with interchangeable sidekicks, the screenplay builds a carefully balanced ensemble where contrasting personalities constantly generate new comic possibilities. Chuck remains the easiest example of how personality can become physical comedy. His defining trait has always been extraordinary speed, but the sequel refuses to treat that ability as a repetitive gimmick. Speed influences everything about his behavior, from the way he thinks to the way he speaks and reacts. His mind races just as quickly as his body, creating an infectious energy that keeps scenes moving even before the action begins. Rather than slowing situations down with lengthy explanations, Chuck often accelerates them into complete chaos, forcing everyone else to adapt. The result is comedy driven not simply by movement, but by momentum itself. Baum operates according to an entirely different rhythm. His explosive abilities could easily have reduced him to a predictable source of destruction, yet the film consistently pairs overwhelming power with remarkable kindness. Baum rarely projects aggression. Instead, he approaches the world with genuine warmth and optimism, making every accidental explosion feel less like recklessness and more like the unfortunate side effect of an exceptionally generous personality. That contrast creates a recurring joke throughout the film. The character capable of causing the greatest physical damage is often the gentlest member of the group. Together, Chuck and Baum quietly demonstrate how the screenplay avoids repeating identical punchlines. One generates comedy through relentless acceleration, while the other produces humor through delayed reactions and affectionate sincerity. Their personalities naturally complement one another because each occupies a different comic frequency. The audience never feels trapped inside a single style of humor for too long. Silver, however, represents the sequel's most significant addition to the ensemble. What makes her particularly refreshing is how completely the screenplay trusts her intelligence. Modern animated films increasingly feature capable female protagonists, yet many still feel obligated to frame those characters primarily through romance or emotional validation. Silver avoids that trap almost entirely. Her identity begins with curiosity, engineering skill, analytical thinking, and practical problem solving. She contributes because she possesses expertise the mission genuinely requires, not because the narrative needs to satisfy a symbolic role. That distinction dramatically changes her relationship with Red. Although romantic tension exists beneath the surface, it never defines her purpose. She does not exist to soften the hero's personality or reward him for personal growth. Instead, she consistently challenges his assumptions, forcing him to recognize limitations within his own leadership. Their interactions revolve around ideas rather than attraction. Respect must be earned through competence, and the eventual emotional connection feels stronger precisely because it develops alongside mutual admiration instead of replacing it. Rachel Bloom's vocal performance reinforces this characterization by balancing confidence with empathy. Silver rarely speaks with arrogance despite regularly being the smartest person in the room. She explains rather than lectures, collaborates rather than competes, and approaches problems with calm determination instead of superiority. Her emotional intelligence becomes just as important as her technical knowledge, preventing the character from becoming a stereotype of the socially detached genius. Leonard contributes a completely different energy to the ensemble. As King of Pig Island, he approaches leadership with theatrical flair rather than disciplined authority. Nearly every scene featuring Leonard carries an element of performance. He enjoys dramatic entrances, exaggerated reactions, and playful self-importance, making him a wonderfully entertaining contrast to Red's constant seriousness. Yet beneath the oversized personality lies genuine adaptability. Unlike many comic authority figures, Leonard proves surprisingly willing to cooperate once circumstances demand it. His ego remains intact, but it no longer prevents meaningful collaboration. The supporting relationships surrounding Leonard enrich this comic identity even further. Courtney amplifies his theatrical tendencies through wonderfully exaggerated interactions that constantly threaten to spiral into delightful absurdity. Their exchanges often function like miniature sketch comedies unfolding alongside the larger narrative, adding bursts of unpredictable humor without interrupting the story's momentum. The jokes succeed because both characters commit completely to the emotional reality of every ridiculous situation. Gary, the inventive pig engineer, fulfills another important role within the ensemble. His creativity provides practical solutions while simultaneously generating visual comedy through increasingly elaborate inventions. Animated comedies often rely on eccentric inventors to introduce imaginative set pieces, but Gary's contributions feel integrated rather than convenient. His devices frequently create as many complications as advantages, reinforcing the film's larger belief that even brilliant ideas require teamwork to succeed. These secondary partnerships highlight an overlooked strength of the screenplay. Comedy rarely depends upon isolated individuals delivering jokes one after another. Instead, humor emerges from relationships. Different personalities collide, misunderstand one another, exaggerate each other's flaws, and unexpectedly reveal complementary strengths. By distributing comic responsibility across numerous character combinations, the film keeps its energy constantly evolving. Perhaps no subplot illustrates this better than the hatchlings. At first glance, their adventure appears almost entirely disconnected from the main narrative. Three tiny characters become absorbed in an increasingly ridiculous quest, navigating oversized environments through expressive physical comedy and visual storytelling that often functions without dialogue. Their scenes resemble classic animated shorts built around escalating obstacles, carefully timed accidents, and determined persistence. Structurally, however, the hatchlings perform a much more sophisticated function. Their miniature adventure mirrors the larger story unfolding around Red and his team. Just as the main characters struggle with cooperation, unexpected setbacks, and seemingly impossible objectives, the hatchlings encounter their own series of escalating challenges. The difference lies primarily in scale. One storyline concerns the fate of entire islands, while the other revolves around a tiny personal mission. Emotionally, however, both narratives explore remarkably similar ideas about perseverance, collaboration, and adapting when carefully made plans collapse. This parallel structure creates subtle thematic unity across the entire film. Younger viewers can enjoy the hatchlings simply because their adventures are funny and visually inventive. Older audiences may recognize how those sequences quietly echo the emotional mechanics of the central plot, reinforcing the same lessons through a completely different storytelling style. Collectively, the supporting cast transforms the Angry Birds Movie 2 from a straightforward hero's journey into a genuine ensemble comedy. Every character occupies a distinct narrative purpose, every personality introduces a unique comic rhythm, and every relationship expands the emotional possibilities available to the story. Rather than asking audiences to invest in a single protagonist carrying the entire experience, the film builds an interconnected community where strengths overlap, weaknesses complement one another, and laughter emerges from collaboration as naturally as victory itself. Beneath its rapid-fire jokes, exaggerated expressions, and wonderfully chaotic action, the Angry Birds Movie 2 is built upon a surprisingly consistent thematic foundation. Nearly every major conflict, whether personal or physical, circles back to the same essential question. What happens when individuals who define themselves through pride, rivalry, or fear are finally forced to rely on one another? The answer unfolds gradually, not through speeches or moral lessons, but through the steady dismantling of every character's belief that they alone can solve the problem. Perhaps the film's strongest statement is its rejection of the traditional individual hero myth. Many adventure stories reward the protagonist for being stronger, smarter, or more determined than everyone else. Red initially believes exactly that. Having earned his reputation by saving Bird Island once before, he assumes leadership means standing at the front, making every decision, and carrying every responsibility himself. His confidence is genuine, but it is also rooted in insecurity. If someone else proves equally capable, then his identity as the indispensable hero suddenly feels uncertain. The screenplay patiently exposes the weakness in that mindset. Every major setback occurs when Red mistakes control for leadership. His greatest growth arrives only after he realizes that leading people does not mean replacing their abilities with his own. It means recognizing strengths that he lacks and trusting others enough to let them succeed. By publicly giving Silver and the rest of the team credit during the climax, Red finally abandons the need to be the sole hero. In doing so, he becomes a far better leader than he ever was while chasing recognition. This idea extends beyond Red and shapes the entire structure of the film. Victory never belongs to one extraordinary individual. It belongs to a collection of imperfect people whose abilities only become meaningful once they work together. Chuck's speed, Bomb's power, Silver's engineering brilliance, Leonard's resourcefulness, and even the hatchling's determination all become indispensable pieces of the same solution. The climax deliberately refuses to crown a single savior because the story itself argues that genuine success is almost always collaborative. A second major theme revolves around accountability. Unlike many family films that resolve conflict through quick apologies or convenient misunderstandings, The Angry Birds Movie 2 recognizes that avoiding responsibility often causes more damage than the original mistake. No character embodies this lesson more clearly than Mighty Eagle. For years, he escaped uncomfortable emotions simply by leaving them behind. His legendary reputation allowed him to hide cowardice beneath confidence, convincing both himself and others that physical strength compensated for emotional weakness. The revelation about Zeta forces that illusion to collapse. His greatest failure was never losing a battle. It was refusing to confront the consequences of his own choices. Importantly, the film never portrays accountability as punishment. Instead, it presents honesty as liberation. Mighty Eagle's willingness to admit his mistakes becomes the first meaningful step toward repairing the damage he helped create. The courage required to face another person after years of avoidance proves far greater than any spectacular rescue sequence. The message is quietly powerful. Real maturity begins when people stop running from the consequences of their actions and start accepting responsibility for changing what they still can. The final thematic pillar emerges from the relationship between birds, pigs, and eagles themselves. At the beginning of the story, every group remains trapped inside inherited assumptions about the others. Their identities have been shaped by old rivalries repeated so often that nobody seriously questions them anymore. Conflict has become tradition. Then the environment changes. Zeta's attacks introduce a danger that neither side can survive alone, exposing how meaningless those old divisions become when everyone faces the same existential threat. Survival creates a perspective that pride never could. Suddenly, the energy once spent maintaining ancient grudges becomes far more valuable when directed towards solving shared problems. This idea carries surprising relevance beyond the animated world of the film. Throughout history, communities divided by ideology, culture, or politics have often discovered that larger challenges ignore those boundaries completely. Natural disasters, environmental crises, and collective emergencies rarely distinguish between opposing sides. They simply demand cooperation. The film communicates this reality through colorful comedy rather than heavy-handed symbolism, but the underlying observation remains remarkably thoughtful. By its conclusion, The Angry Birds Movie 2 suggests that lasting peace is not achieved because differences disappear. Birds remain birds. Pigs remain pigs. Eagles remain eagles. What changes is their understanding that identity does not require permanent hostility. Communities become stronger when they recognize shared humanity before inherited division, shared responsibility before personal glory, and shared survival before endless rivalry. For a film inspired by launching cartoon birds from a slingshot, that is an unexpectedly mature vision of what real leadership, forgiveness, and unity can ultimately look like. One of the most overlooked strengths of The Angry Birds Movie 2 is how often it communicates ideas without asking its characters to explain them aloud. Beneath the non-stop comedy lies an animation language built around color, environment, and visual repetition. Long before the audience consciously analyzes the story, the film is already shaping emotional expectations through the spaces its characters inhabit. Every island feels like an extension of the personalities living there, turning geography itself into another storyteller. The contrast begins with Bird Island and Pig Island. Although the two communities maintain their playful rivalry, both environments are dominated by warm, welcoming palettes. Rich greens, soft yellows, bright tropical blues, and vibrant natural textures create a feeling of abundance. Trees sway gently, sunlight fills open spaces, and the architecture feels playful rather than imposing. Even when the characters argue or launch ridiculous pranks at one another, the world itself communicates comfort. These are places where life can flourish, making conflict feel more like an interruption than a defining characteristic. That warmth subtly influences the audience's emotional response. Color psychology has long suggested that saturated greens and golden tones evoke growth, safety, optimism, and familiarity. Whether viewers consciously recognize those associations or not, the film uses them to establish Bird and Pig Islands as living communities worth protecting. They are visually inviting worlds filled with energy and possibility, reinforcing the optimistic spirit beneath the film's humor. Eagle Island immediately disrupts that emotional rhythm. Instead of lush vegetation and welcoming sunlight, the landscape becomes an endless expanse of crystalline blues, icy whites, and rigid geometric formations. The environment appears sharp rather than soft, emphasizing hard edges where Bird Island favored rounded shapes and organic movement. Every surface reflects coldness. Every structure feels isolated from the next. Even before Zeta appears, the audience instinctively senses that this is a place where warmth struggles to survive. The addition of vivid magenta accents within this frozen world creates another fascinating layer of visual tension. Zeta's brilliant feathers and bursts of saturated pink refuse to blend naturally into the surrounding environment. Rather than harmonizing with the landscape, they clash against it, making her presence impossible to ignore. The contrast reflects her own emotional conflict. She is someone who longs for warmth while remaining trapped inside an existence defined by relentless cold. Her appearance constantly reminds viewers that she does not truly belong in the world she rules. Ice itself becomes one of the film's most effective visual metaphors. On a literal level, it serves as the weapon threatening both islands. Symbolically, however, it represents emotional stagnation. Eagle Island is not merely frozen because of its climate. Its inhabitants are trapped inside unresolved histories, old disappointments, and relationships that never progressed beyond betrayal and resentment. Nothing grows because nobody has emotionally moved forward. This symbolism becomes particularly meaningful when viewed through the relationship between Zeta and Mighty Eagle. Years after their separation, both characters remain psychologically frozen in the moment everything fell apart. Mighty Eagle buries guilt beneath arrogance, while Zeta hardens heartbreak into bitterness. Neither has allowed themselves to heal. The frozen landscape surrounding them quietly externalizes that emotional condition, turning the island itself into a reflection of lives suspended in unresolved pain. By comparison, Bird Island's warmer colors represent emotional flexibility. Its characters certainly possess flaws, but they continue changing, adapting, and forming new relationships. Growth remains possible because the environment visually encourages movement rather than permanence. Even the playful rivalry with Pig Island evolves over time, reinforcing the idea that warmer spaces symbolize emotional openness while colder ones suggest resistance to change. Another recurring visual symbol quietly transforms across the entire story: the slingshot. For audiences familiar with the original mobile game, the slingshot immediately carries a specific meaning. It represents conflict. Every level begins by loading another bird, taking aim, and launching toward destruction. The mechanic became one of the most recognizable images in modern gaming, forever associated with battle between birds and pigs. The sequel gradually redefines that symbol. Rather than functioning exclusively as a weapon, launching through the air increasingly becomes an act of movement, cooperation, and rescue. Characters propel themselves towards shared objectives instead of simple retaliation. The familiar motion remains visually exciting, but its purpose changes completely. What once existed to destroy barriers now helps overcome them. That transformation mirrors the film's broader narrative. Old tools do not necessarily disappear when people choose peace. Instead, they acquire new meanings. The same object that once fueled endless rivalry becomes part of collective problem-solving, suggesting that history itself can be reinterpreted without being erased. This idea extends throughout the production's visual philosophy. Environments, colors, and recurring imagery never remain static. As relationships evolve, the symbolism surrounding them evolves as well. Warmth spreads where hostility once dominated. Familiar icons lose their association with conflict and gain new significance through cooperation. Ultimately, the Angry Birds Movie 2 demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of animated storytelling by allowing visual design to carry emotional weight alongside dialogue and action. Every vibrant tropical landscape, every frozen crystal, every bold splash of color, and every soaring launch through the sky contributes to the same underlying message. Worlds do not become welcoming because the scenery changes first. They become welcoming because the people living within them finally choose to change, allowing even the landscapes around them to feel transformed.